There's a connection at the hospital. When you go, you can ask the doctor to give you more days off than you actually need. And when you're at the pharmacy, you can ask the pharmacist to inflate your medical bill. For a small cut, they'll add extra costs to the receipt. You submit that to the company, and they'll reimburse you for the full amount. You get to keep the extra money. My name is Mr. Akoto, and this is the story of how I followed a dream, only to find myself facing unexpected challenges that changed my perspective on life, business, and what it means to return home. I was born and raised in Ghana, the son of wealthy parents who ensured I had everything I needed to succeed. My childhood was filled with the joys of family gatherings, the warmth of the Ghanaian sun, and the pride of my cultural heritage. Yet, like many young people with big dreams, I was eager to see the world beyond the borders of my homeland. At the age of 20, with my parents' blessings, I left Ghana for Canada, where I would spend the next 2 decades of my life. Canada was a land of opportunity, and I seized every chance to build a successful life. I pursued a degree in chemical engineering, a field that fascinated me with its blend of science and practicality. My hard work paid off, and soon I found myself not only excelling in my career, but also branching out into various business ventures. Over the years, I built several businesses from the ground up, each one contributing to the comfortable life I enjoyed. I was proud of my achievements, but deep down, I always knew that Canada was not where I wanted to spend the rest of my life. Ghana, with its rich culture and vibrant communities, was never far from my thoughts. I missed the sense of belonging that came with being surrounded by my people, the familiar sounds of the local markets, and the feeling of being connected to my roots. As I grew older, the longing to return home became stronger. I began to dream of a life back in Ghana, where I could use the skills and experiences I had gained in Canada to make a difference. I wanted to create something meaningful, something that would not only sustain me, but also provide opportunities for the youth in my country. 5 months before my planned return to Ghana, I reconnected with an old friend, Wofa Pa Kwasi. He was a fellow Ghanaian who had also made a name for himself abroad, running successful businesses both in Ghana and overseas. We met over coffee one cold morning in Toronto, and as we talked, he shared a burden that had been weighing heavily on him. Wofa had started a company in Ghana years ago, importing foreign doors, furniture, and household goods from China and Turkey. The business had thrived for a while, but in recent years it had taken a downturn. No matter what he did, the company seemed to be on a downward spiral. He had tried everything, replacing management teams, injecting more capital, even taking a more hands-on approach. But nothing worked. The company kept losing money, and Wofa was at his wits' end. As he spoke, I could see the frustration in his eyes. Wofa was a proud man, not one to easily admit defeat, but this situation had clearly taken a toll on him. He told me that he was considering selling the company, even though it pained him to do so. It was a business he had built with his own hands, a venture that once held so much promise. But now it seemed like a sinking ship, and he was ready to let it go. I listened intently, feeling a mix of emotions. On one hand, I sympathized with Wofa. I understood the pain of seeing something you've worked so hard for slip away. On the other hand, I saw an opportunity. Here was a company already established, with the potential to be turned around. I had the experience, the knowledge, and most importantly, the passion to take on the challenge. I had always wanted to return to Ghana and start a business that would allow me to live peacefully while making a positive impact. Perhaps this was the opportunity I had been waiting for. I told Wofa that I was interested in buying the company. His eyes widened in surprise, but then he nodded slowly. We agreed to go through the necessary paperwork and discuss the details of the sale. I could see the relief in his face, and in that moment, I felt confident that I was making the right decision. Little did I know that this decision would lead me down a path filled with unexpected challenges. After months of negotiations and legal procedures, the company was finally mine. After finalizing the paperwork and officially acquiring the company from Wofa Parkwasi, I found myself at a crossroads. I had inherited a company that was plagued with challenges, but I believed I had the skills, knowledge, and determination to turn things around. However, I also knew that a sudden change in leadership could destabilize the already fragile situation. Therefore, I proposed to Wofa that we keep the ownership transfer confidential for a while. I trusted him to continue in his role as CEO for a few more months while I observed and learned from the inside. Wofa agreed, and we decided to keep the truth between us. With the plan in place, I returned to Ghana, ready to embark on this new chapter of my life. But instead of stepping into my role as the company's owner, I decided to start from the ground up, applying for a position within the company as a logistics coordinator, a role that would allow me to understand the inner workings of the business without drawing attention to myself. This position was crucial because logistics was one of the areas I had identified as a potential weak point in the company's operations. My goal was to blend in with the staff, learn about the company's issues firsthand, and then gradually implement changes that would lead to its recovery. I sent in my application with a mix of excitement and nervousness. Wofa had told me that the previous logistics coordinator had been dismissed, so I assumed that my application would be welcomed. But to my surprise, I received a curt reply from the company stating that there were no vacancies. Confused, I decided to follow up in person. Perhaps there had been some misunderstanding or a delay in updating the vacancy status. When I visited the Human Resources HR department, I was met with a frosty reception. The HR manager, a middle-aged man with a stern demeanor, barely looked up from his desk as I introduced myself and inquired about the status of my application. He informed me rather brusquely that there were no positions available and that I should check back in a week. His tone was dismissive, and it was clear that he wasn't interested in helping me. Despite this, I wasn't ready to give up. I returned the following week, hoping for a more positive outcome. The HR manager's attitude hadn't changed. He reiterated that there were no vacancies, but then, as if an afterthought, he leaned back in his chair and eyed me critically. He told me that, as the HR manager, he was the only person who could authorize new hires, regardless of what the CEO wanted. He claimed that there were numerous applications for the position, and that my chances were slim unless I was willing to sweeten the deal. In other words, he was asking for a bribe. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Here I was, the new owner of the company, being asked to pay a bribe just to get a job within my own business. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me, but I also realized that this was a reflection of the deeper issues within the company. Corruption, favoritism, and a lack of integrity were eating away at the very foundation of the business, and the HR manager was just one of many who were contributing to its downfall. I needed the job desperately, not for the salary, but for the opportunity to understand the company from the inside out. So, I tried to negotiate with the HR manager. I told him that I didn't have any money at the moment, But if he could employ me, I would be willing to have the bribe deducted from my salary over time. It was a desperate attempt to secure the position, but it also highlighted the lengths I was willing to go to in order to get to the bottom of the company's problems. The HR manager wasn't impressed. He flatly refused my offer, stating that he didn't deal in installments. He wanted the money up front, and without it, there was nothing he could do for me. I could feel the anger and frustration boiling inside me, but I kept my composure. I knew that this was just the beginning of the challenges I would face in trying to turn the company around. I promised him that I would return in a week with the money, all the while feeling a deep sense of disillusionment with the reality of the situation. As I left the office that day, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: anger, disappointment, and a growing resolve to take action. The challenges I was encountering were far deeper than I had anticipated. This wasn't just about poor management or market conditions. This was about a culture of corruption that was deeply ingrained within the company. I realized that if I was to succeed in turning things around, I would have to tackle these issues head-on, starting from the very people who were supposed to be driving the company forward. A week later, I found myself standing in front of the HR office once again, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. I had spent countless nights wrestling with the decision I was about to make, feeling torn between my principles and the harsh reality I faced. This was not the triumphant return to Ghana I had envisioned, nor was it the way I had imagined beginning my journey with the company I had just acquired. Yet, if I was to truly understand the challenges plaguing the business, I had to play the game that was being played. As I walked into the HR office, my pulse quickened. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I approached Mr. Akwaboah's desk. He looked up, his expression as unreadable as ever. Without a word, I handed him an envelope, knowing full well what it contained: a bribe to secure a position in the very company I now owned. The act felt wrong on every level, yet I knew it was a necessary step if I wanted to gain the trust and access needed to turn things around. Mr. Akwaboah took the envelope without hesitation, his face showing no emotion as he briefly nodded in acknowledgement. As he slipped the envelope into his drawer, I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. My qualifications weren't perfect. In fact, the certificate I had submitted was forged specifically for this role. I needed to remain incognito, and this false identity was my best shot at embedding myself within the company without drawing attention to my true identity as the new owner. After a moment of silence, Mr. Akwaboah picked up his phone and dialed Wofa on WhatsApp. His demeanor shifted as he spoke, adopting a tone of respect and deference that I hadn't seen before, as he informed Wofa that he'd found a suitable candidate for the logistics coordinator position. I felt my heart race. This was the moment of truth. Would Wofa go along with it? Despite everything, I trusted him, and it seemed he still trusted Mr. Akwaboah. A few moments later, I could hear Wofa's voice faintly through the phone, giving his approval for the hire. The decision was made. I was in. "Come back in 3 days," Mr. Akwaboah said, his voice reverting to its usual stern tone as he hung up the call. "You'll have your interview then." I nodded, thanked him, and left the office. My emotions were a tangled mess of relief, guilt, and anticipation. When the day of the interview arrived, I walked into the office with a sense of resolve. The panel consisted of Mr. Akwaboah and 2 other senior managers, both of whom seemed disinterested in the formalities. It was clear that they had already made up their minds about hiring me. The interview felt like nothing more than a performance to justify the decision that had already been made. Despite the charade, I answered their questions confidently. I spoke about my understanding of logistics, my approach to problem solving, and my commitment to the role. It was surreal, playing the part of a job applicant in a company I owned, but I knew it was a necessary step in my plan. As the interview concluded, I noticed the approving nods from the panel. Mr. Akwaboah in particular seemed satisfied. After a brief discussion among themselves, they informed me that I had been successful. I was officially the new logistics coordinator of the company. As I walked out of the office, the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. I had secured the job, but at a cost that left me questioning my decisions. The bribe, the forged certificate, the deception. It all felt wrong, yet I knew that this was just the beginning. My mission was far from over. Now I had to focus on the real work, uncovering the issues that were dragging the company down and finding a way to restore its former glory. Starting work in the company, I was determined to blend in while learning everything I could about the internal dynamics. My resolve was tested from the very first day. Accustomed to the discipline and punctuality I had honed during my years abroad, I was always the first person to report to work. In Canada, time was a currency we didn't joke about, and I carried that ethos with me. However, what I observed upon returning to Ghana was a stark contrast to the environment I was used to. Every morning, I would sit at my desk, watching as the clock ticked away the minutes and then the hours. The other staff members, including Mr. Akwaboah, would stroll in leisurely, often hours late. It seemed like punctuality was more of a suggestion than a requirement. But it wasn't just the lateness that troubled me, it was the casual acceptance of it by everyone around me. No one seemed to care. Worse still, as I got to know the staff, I realized that many of them were relatives of the company's employees. Nepotism was rampant, and it was clear that many unskilled workers had been recruited simply because of their family ties. This lack of professionalism was already a red flag, but the deeper I dug, the more disheartened I became. My observations revealed a shocking truth. Many of these relatives didn't even show up for work regularly, yet they were still receiving full salaries. Some would come in for just 10 days in a month, and they would be paid as though they had worked every single day. The system was rife with corruption, and it became clear to me that this was not an isolated issue, but a systemic one. My heart swelled with anger as I realized the extent of the rot within the company. Yet I knew I had to keep my emotions in check. I had to pretend that everything was fine, even though every fiber of my being was screaming in protest. I decided to play the role of a humble, unassuming employee. I greeted everyone warmly and went out of my way to be helpful. Whenever Mr. Akwaboah arrived at the company, I would rush to greet him at his car, offer to carry his bag, and make sure he was comfortable. My humility and respectful demeanor quickly earned me his favor. He loved the way I treated him and often praised my attitude to the other staff members. Little did he know that my actions were part of a calculated plan to remain inconspicuous while gathering as much information as possible. As the end of the month approached, I noticed the first signs of another problem. The workers were supposed to be paid on the 28th of each month, but payday came and went without a single payment being made. The days stretched on, and it wasn't until the 15th of the following month that the salaries were finally disbursed. What made this even more appalling was that the management, including the HR and the accountant, had already paid themselves on time. The regular staff, however, were left to wait, unsure when or if their salaries would come. It was during this time that I uncovered yet another layer of corruption. The accountant and the management team had devised a two-pronged approach to enriching themselves at the expense of the workers. First, they would submit payroll documents to WOFA that included inflated overtime hours for the staff. But in reality, no overtime was ever paid out to the workers. Instead, the money was pocketed and distributed among the management team. This was how they had been siphoning off funds for years, turning the company into their own personal cash cow. Watching this unfold, I felt a deep sense of disillusionment. I had known corruption existed in many places, but seeing it up close, in a company I now owned, was something else entirely. I had prepared myself mentally for challenges, but the extent of the dishonesty and greed was overwhelming. It was hard for me to process how people could be so inhumane, so willing to exploit others for their own gain. The very people who were supposed to be leading the company were the ones pulling it down, brick by brick. Despite my inner turmoil, I kept my head down and continued to observe. I knew that confronting the corruption head-on would be premature and could jeopardize my entire plan. As I settled into my role at the company, I made it a point to befriend everyone, from the top management to the drivers. My goal was to gain their trust, and in doing so, learn the inner workings of the company from every angle. It wasn't long before I became a familiar face in every department, sharing meals with the workers and chatting with them about their daily struggles. My humility and willingness to engage with everyone endeared me to the staff. And soon, they began to open up to me, revealing the various ways they navigated the challenges of working in a company where corruption was the norm. One day, I was assigned to accompany the chief driver to refuel one of the company vehicles. It seemed like a routine task, but it turned out to be anything but. As we drove towards the filling station, the driver started a conversation that sent chills down my spine. "Listen, boss," he began, glancing over at me as he steered the vehicle down the road. "You seem like a good guy, so I'm going to give you some advice. This company doesn't pay well. If you don't play smart, you'll end up with nothing." I was curious but cautious. "What do you mean by playing smart?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. He looked at me, his expression a mix of resignation and determination. "Let me explain. You're the logistics coordinator now, right? That means you're in a good position to make some extra cash on the side. When we go to the filling station today, I'll show you how it's done." I nodded, feigning interest. "How can I earn something extra?" The driver smirked and continued. "There's a connection at the filling station. If we buy 2,000 CDs worth of fuel, I'll have the attendant write up an invoice for 3,000 CDs instead. I'll give the attendant 200 CDs. You'll get 300 CDs, and I'll keep 500 CDs for myself. That's how all the drivers in this company make a living, because the salary isn't enough. It's just the way things are here." My heart sank as I listened to him lay out the scheme so casually, as if it were just another part of the job. But I maintained my composure. "Is that really how it's done?" I asked, playing along. "It seems so simple." "It is," he replied, his voice full of confidence. "The filling station attendants are in on it. They know the game, and it's a win-win for everyone involved. You see, in Ghana, this isn't called robbery or stealing. It's called connection. That's just how things work here. You have to be smart if you want to survive." As he spoke, my mind raced. I knew I was getting closer to the truth of why the company was failing. It wasn't just the management siphoning off funds. This culture of corruption had permeated every level of the organization. Everyone was in on it, from the top executives down to the drivers and even the filling station attendants. The realization was both horrifying and enlightening. We arrived at the filling station, and as the driver had described, the transaction went off without a hitch. The attendant wrote up the inflated invoice without blinking an eye, and before I knew it, I had 300 cedis in my pocket, the spoils of this so-called connection. The driver pocketed his share and gave the attendant his cut, all in a matter of minutes. It was clear that this was a well-oiled machine, a system of deceit that everyone involved had perfected over time. As we drove back to the office, I felt a deep sense of unease. I couldn't help but think about the implications of what I had just witnessed. This wasn't just a matter of a few dishonest employees skimming money off the top. It was a systemic issue that was bleeding the company dry. And yet, no one seemed to care. They were too focused on filling their own pockets, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent to the long-term damage they were causing. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked the driver, trying to keep the conversation going. He shrugged. "For as long as I've been here, everyone does it. If you don't, you'll be the odd one out, and trust me, you don't want that. It's just the way things are, boss. No one thinks twice about it." I nodded, but inside my anger was boiling over. How could they be so short-sighted? Didn't they realize that by indulging in these connections, they were jeopardizing the very company that provided their livelihoods? It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it also strengthened my resolve. I had to do something to stop this, to turn things around before it was too late. But for now, I had to continue playing my part. I knew that if I reacted too strongly, I might blow my cover and lose the trust I had worked so hard to build. As the days went on, I continued to collect evidence, recording conversations and documenting every instance of corruption I encountered. Each interaction, like the one with the driver, only added to the growing pile of proof that I was amassing. I knew that when the time came, I would need every piece of it to bring about the changes the company so desperately needed. One day, I arrived at work feeling unusually fatigued. My body was telling me something was off, so I decided to mention it to the accountant during our usual morning conversation. I told him that I wasn't feeling well and might need to see a doctor. Per the company's rules, when an employee is sick, they're expected to visit the hospital, pay their own medical bills, and then present the receipts to the accountant, who would confirm them and reimburse the expenses. It seemed like a straightforward process, but little did I know, even this had been corrupted. The accountant, always eager to share advice, leaned in with a sly grin. "You're not feeling well? That's actually a good opportunity to earn some extra money," he said, his tone casual, as if he was sharing a well-kept secret. I was taken aback. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, curious, but wary of what he might suggest. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he explained. "There's a connection at the hospital. When you go, you can ask the doctor to give you more days off than you actually need. And when you're at the pharmacy, you can ask the pharmacist to inflate your medical bill. For a small cut, they'll add extra costs to the receipt. You submit that to the company, and they'll reimburse you for the full amount. You get to keep the extra money." His words left me speechless for a moment. I had already seen how deeply rooted corruption was within the company, but this was a whole new level. Even sickness was being exploited as a way to siphon money from the company's coffers. The accountant spoke about it so casually, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. It was shocking, to say the least. Feigning interest, I decided to see just how far this connection extended. "So, how do I go about this?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Simple," he replied. When you see the doctor, just tell him you're feeling really bad and that you need more time to rest. He'll probably give you a few extra days off without a problem. And at the pharmacy, you can tell them you've already bought some medication elsewhere, and they'll inflate the bill for you. Give them a little something for their trouble, and you're good to go." I nodded, trying to process what I was hearing. This was yet another way the company was being bled dry by the very people who were supposed to keep it running. And the worst part? It was happening with the full knowledge and participation of those in charge. Later that day, I went to the hospital, not only because I was genuinely unwell, but also to see just how far this corruption reached. I explained my symptoms to the doctor and mentioned that I was feeling exhausted, asking if I could have more days off to recover. The doctor, without hesitation, wrote me a note granting 10 days of rest, far more than I needed. Then I mentioned to him that I had purchased some herbal remedies before coming to the hospital, but didn't have a receipt for them. I asked if he could add an additional 800 cedis to my medical bill so that I could get reimbursed by the company. The doctor didn't even blink. He wrote it up, handed me the inflated bill, and I slipped him 200 cedis as a thank you for his cooperation. Just like that, I had earned 600 cedis for doing nothing, and the company would be the one footing the bill. As I left the hospital, a mix of emotions washed over me. On one hand, I was disgusted by how easy it was to exploit the system. On the other hand, I was accumulating more evidence of the corruption that was eating away at the company from the inside out. Every step of the way, from the drivers to the accountants to the medical staff, everyone was in on the game, lining their pockets while the company slowly bled out. When I returned to the office and handed over my inflated medical bill, the accountant didn't even bother to look it over thoroughly. He just nodded, stamped it, and told me to expect my reimbursement soon. It was clear that this was business as usual, a routine scam that everyone was comfortable with. That evening, as I sat alone in my office, I couldn't help but think about the implications of what I had just done. If everyone in the company was participating in schemes like this, creating fake receipts, inflating expenses, and pocketing the difference, how could the company ever hope to survive? Every CD stolen was another nail in the company's coffin, and it was all being done by the very people who should have been its stewards. I thought about the long-term consequences. This wasn't just about money being siphoned off here and there. It was about the culture of the company. A culture where greed was the norm, where cheating and lying were not only accepted, but expected. In such an environment, how could the company possibly thrive? The more I uncovered, the more I realized that this wasn't just a business problem, it was a moral one. After just 2 days of resting at home, I decided to return to work. I knew it would raise eyebrows, but I wasn't one to sit idle. As expected, when I walked into the office, everyone was shocked to see me back so soon. It was practically unheard of for someone to cut their sick leave short, especially in a company where exploiting every opportunity for personal gain was the norm. "You're back already?" the accountant asked, clearly surprised. I shrugged, offering a smile. "Yes, I'm feeling much better now. And honestly, I had nothing to do at home. I'd rather be here, staying productive." The accountant raised an eyebrow, but didn't push further. My quick return added another layer to my persona at the company, someone who was dedicated and possibly a little too straightforward for their comfort. They didn't need to know that while I appeared dedicated on the surface, I was secretly financing the company's needs with the help of Wofa, the previous owner. The truth was, I couldn't stand seeing the company fail due to the rampant corruption that had taken hold. A few weeks later, the company decided to extend its warehouse, and as the logistics manager, I was put in charge of overseeing the building materials. The HR manager brought in a construction company to provide estimates for the project. I was there during the initial meeting, along with the accountant and a few other key staff members who were involved in running the company. We listened as the construction company presented their preliminary estimates, noting the costs for materials, labor, and other expenses. A few days after the initial meeting, the construction company returned with their final estimate. Once they left, the accountant, HR manager, operations manager, and I gathered for a private meeting. It was clear from the start that this was not going to be a straightforward discussion. "Here's what we're going to do," the HR manager said, leaning forward in his chair, his voice low and conspiratorial. "We'll tell the construction company to increase their estimate by 50%. If they agree to this, we'll award them the project. If they refuse, we'll find another company that will play along." I glanced around the room, noting the approving nods from the others. It was as if they were discussing a perfectly legitimate business strategy, rather than a blatant act of corruption. "Are you serious?" I asked, feigning surprise. "You want them to inflate the cost by 50%? "Of course," the accountant chimed in, smirking. "That's how we do things here. The extra money will be split among us. It's a win-win. The construction company gets the project, and we all make a little something on the side." I nodded slowly, playing along. "And if they don't agree?" The operations manager chuckled. "Then we find another company that will. Trust me, no one is going to turn down easy money. They'll play ball." A few days later, we called the construction company back into the office. The HR manager laid out our request, and as expected, they didn't hesitate. They adjusted their estimate to include the additional 50%, and just like that, the project was theirs. The entire process was shockingly smooth, a testament to how deeply ingrained these practices were within the business world in Ghana. After the meeting, we all sat around a table, dividing up the extra money that had been added to the project estimate. It was a substantial amount, and as we each pocketed our share, I couldn't help but reflect on what I was witnessing. "See, it's easy," the accountant said with a grin, counting his cash. "This is how you get ahead in this business." I nodded, but inside I felt a growing sense of disillusionment. The more I saw, the clearer it became why so many companies in Ghana and across Africa struggle or outright fail. It wasn't just bad luck or external factors. It was the internal rot, the pervasive culture of corruption that was dragging these businesses down. "Why do you think so many companies collapse?" I asked, looking at the accountant, feigning curiosity. He shrugged. "It's not our problem, boss. We're just making the most of what we've got. Besides, if we didn't do it, someone else would. Everyone does it. But what about the long-term effects? Doesn't it bother you that this might be contributing to the company's struggles?" I pressed, wanting to see how far their justifications would go. The operations manager laughed. "Long-term? Who cares about the long-term? We're here to make money now. The future isn't guaranteed for anyone. You take what you can while you can." Their words were chilling, not because of their cynicism, but because of how commonplace this mindset seemed to be. It was clear that this wasn't just about individual greed. It was a systemic issue that was deeply embedded in the business culture. The short-term gains they were all so eager to grab were coming at the cost of the company's and ultimately the economy's future. As I pocketed my share, My mind was racing. This wasn't just about one project or one company. It was about an entire system that incentivized dishonesty, where success was measured by how well you could manipulate the system to your advantage. I understood now more than ever why so many businesses in Ghana and across Africa fail. It wasn't just the external pressures. They were being sabotaged from within by the very people who were supposed to be leading them. I knew that I couldn't keep playing along forever. At some point, I would have to take action to try to change the culture that was poisoning the company. But for now, I continued to gather evidence, preparing for the day when I could confront this corruption head-on. The road ahead was daunting, but I was determined to see it through. This company, and the people who depended on it, deserved better. And I was going to do everything in my power to ensure that they got it. The company had recently imported several high-value goods, including bulletproof doors, furniture, and various household items, to replenish the 70% of inventory that was out of stock. As the logistics manager, I had been the one to make this purchase through WOFA, and I was anxious to see how these goods would be handled upon arrival. Deep down, I knew this would be a critical moment, an opportunity to expose the corruption I had been documenting. This was where I would strike. As the goods were en route, I requested WOFA to send me a complete list of the workers and staff employed by the company. What I found was both shocking and disheartening. The list contained far more names than the actual number of employees working at the company. It was clear that ghost names had been added, fictitious employees created solely for the purpose of siphoning off salaries. Each month, the money allocated for these ghost workers was deducted from the company's funds and shared among the real staff members. This practice wasn't limited to just our company. It was a widespread issue across many private and government-run organizations in Ghana. Ghost names have become a common tool for embezzlement, draining resources from businesses and contributing to their eventual downfall. As one wise observer once noted, corruption is like a ball of snow. Once it's set a-rolling, it must increase. Every time these ghost names were used to steal from the company, they were pushing it closer to collapse, one dishonest transaction at a time. It's no wonder that so many Ghanaians living abroad, despite having the financial means, are hesitant to set up businesses back home. They've seen or heard about the pervasive corruption and know how difficult it can be to maintain a successful enterprise in such an environment. As one saying goes, the accomplice to the crime of corruption is often our own indifference. It's this indifference, this acceptance of corruption as just another part of doing business that allows it to flourish. I'm not saying that every Ghanaian is corrupt. Far from it. There are countless hard-working, honest people who contribute positively to the economy and society. But it only takes a few bad actors to poison the well, so to speak. Some people, blinded by their greed, fail to realize that every seed eye stolen from a company weakens it. They see executive directors as endlessly wealthy, thinking that their theft won't make a difference. But they forget, or perhaps they don't care, that even a mighty river can be drained if you divert enough of its water. To quote the Roman statesman Cicero, "The arrogance of officialdom should be tempered and controlled, and assistance to foreign hands should be curtailed, lest Rome fall." Substitute: Rome with any company or country. And the message remains just as relevant. Unchecked corruption will ultimately lead to collapse, no matter how strong the entity may seem. As I continued my investigation, I knew that the real test would come when the imported goods arrived. How they would handle this shipment would be the ultimate litmus test of the company's integrity, or lack thereof. I had to prepare for what was coming, for this would be the moment I could no longer remain silent. The theft, the lies, and the manipulation had gone on long enough. The company's survival depended on exposing the rot from within. But that story will have to wait for the next episode. In the meantime, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced or witnessed corruption in your own workplace or in your country? If so, share your story with us by simply commenting, "Yes." Let's open up the conversation about this issue that affects so many, but is often left unspoken. And before you go, please subscribe to Anansi Web of Tales. And don't forget to like, comment, and share this video. Let us know where you're watching from. We're building a community of truth seekers, and your voice is an important part of that. Stay tuned, because in the next episode, I'll reveal even deeper layers of corruption that I uncovered while pretending to be just another worker in the very company I had bought. Together, we can shine a light on these issues and work towards a future where integrity prevails over greed.